Hey everybody, welcome back. Tonight we're going to talk about how to select a vineyard site, which I know is a question burning inside of all of you, but we'll go over that tonight. So for this presentation, we'll actually do a part 1 and a part 2. We'll go into that in a moment. I'll tell you what will be what. But both of these presentations will follow chapter 4 in the Grape Grower's Handbook, which is our textbook for this course. So yes, let us begin. Okay, so an overview of what we're going to talk about, why site selection is important, right? The major components that define a site, such as climate, topography, and soil, but also water requirements and the quality of water. We don't always have access to the most quality water for agriculture, or let alone for human consumption. I know that might be surprising because we just take it for granted all the time, but that's also a component we're going to talk about. For today's presentation, this was a lot of information to kind of just go over, so we're just going to talk about climate today, and then our next presentation, which will be 4.5, lecture 4.5, it will be part 2, which will cover topography, soil, and then the water requirements and quality as well. So just part 1 today. Okay, so yeah, part 1, climate. Okay. Picking a vineyard site. So if you know a little bit about grapevines at this point, you'll know that they're very hardy. Grapevines are just these structural parasites. They're these monsters that just thrive and grow despite the odds in a lot of these really extreme conditions. So why do we have to find a site that works well for them? Well, depending on the site that you pick, if this is going to be a business and not just a hobby, you might have to spend a lot of money to prepare the land for grape cultivation, right? And even though these grapevines may survive in a lot of areas, you want them to thrive and produce good fruit to make good wine. So it really makes a difference in quality when you break it down. Also, establishing a vineyard is a very, very permanent decision, so you want to make sure you do it right the first time. It takes years and tens of thousands of dollars, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, if depending on how much acreage you're trying to set up. So it's really important that you know what you're doing and that you do it right the first time. Also, just knowledge of your site in general can only benefit you. It'll only benefit the quality of grapes that you produce, right? So certain conditions will require specific management practices. And also, this kind of contributes to the overall concept of terroir. So if you've taken my other classes, this is a concept we talk about in just about every class that we teach here at Folsom College. But basically, it's a combination of physical environment, so like landform, altitude, slope, soil, etc., and then also natural phenomena. So climate, heat summations, seasonal variations from year to year, and much, much more, right? So the definition of terroir is, it's a French concept, which means a sense of place. And it's when you can taste a product. Normally it refers to wine, but it can also refer to other things as well, like honey or, why am I blanking right now? Cheese, ham, like cured meats, like tea. There's so many other products that reflect the region that it was grown in, right? So it's a product, most of the time wine, that was that captures the physical and natural environment of that vineyard, and it gets transported into the product that you're consuming, right? So it's a style in wine created by the combination of physical and cultural practices in the vineyard. And there's a lot of merit to that. Yeah. Okay, so climate overall, right? So when we think of grapevines, normally we think of Mediterranean climates, but grapevines are actually produced all over the world, right? In very different climates. So we have Mediterranean, of course, but we also have marine West Coast. So think of Oregon, right? It's very evergreen, Oregon and Washington. It can be cooler most of the time up there. We also have humid subtropical, so Eastern Australia is an example of this type of climate, and we have grape varieties growing there as well. Then we also have semi-arid continental climates like Eastern Washington State. And how does this work? Well, one is you have to select the right grape variety for that climate, right? We can't grow everything across the board in all those completely different regions. You have to select the right variety. Sometimes it's a hybrid, sometimes it's part European and part American varieties that are hybridized together. American varieties are typically much more cold hardy and can deal with humidity a lot better than European ones, right? So that's a whole situation there. Another thing that we do to make sure that grapevines are successful wherever we plant them is by designing the vineyard, the trellising, and the other processes that work with the specific site that you are on, right? So two of my favorite examples are, we have this one up top. This is Santorini, Italy. And these are linked to articles if you'd like to open them up and read more about it. I think it's super interesting. So in Santorini, Italy, this is right on the coastline. The vines are grown in extremely dry and windy conditions. There's barely any water accessible in a lot of Italy, unfortunately now in Greece. But in Santorini, they actually train the grapevines to be this little kind of Easter basket looking training system, where the vine grows onto itself and then actually creates this basin that protects the grapes that are growing inside. It also helps the water that's in the air to condense and be captured by the roots in the soil there. And then the leaves on this outer part will help capture sunlight and ripen the grapes. But very low production, as you could probably imagine, not a lot of fruit being produced. Very painstakingly tedious as far as vineyard work, but we can still grow grapes there nonetheless. So very cool. And then here on the bottom, we have a very polar opposite example of that. We have Rías Baixas, which is a winemaking region in Spain. This is very humid. It's right next to the water. We have, like I said, really high humidity in this region. So they have a pergola training system. Excuse me. This is a training system that's also used in Japan to help with the monsoons that come through. It's very wet and humid in the summertime when it's ripening. So this will actually open up space below the canopy for air to come through to prevent any mildew from forming. And then those vines can still produce fruit and they still produce high quality wine. So there you have it. Two very different examples of climates. Okay, and then for classification of climates, you have a nice graphic here, but we'll go through the definitions for you. So you have macroclimate, which is the climate of a large geographic region, such as Napa Valley. Mesoclimate is a small area, such as an individual vineyard or hillside, which is influenced by topography, the compass orientation or the aspect, slope, and then also barriers to air movement. Then we have microclimate, which is the climate from the soil upwards into the vine canopy. So it's within the vineyard canopy itself. This can be really different than the outside of the canopy. It doesn't seem like it would be, but it's actually shady, of course. There's a lot more humidity typically. Temperature can be completely different, and then the ability for air to flow through is also an important aspect, right? This is important because it contains the fruit zone, so where all the fruit is being produced, and as it's ripening, it's going to impact the success of that cluster to ripen properly. So different types of climates to think about on a range. We're going to talk about macroclimate a lot in this presentation, and then we'll get into topography and more like the mesoclimate components in our next presentation, so part 2. Cool. So key climate indices to understand climate. So how are we measuring this? What index are we using to measure these things so we understand what the climate is at our vineyard site, right? So one, it's really helpful to use data loggers and weather stations. That's this picture right here. This is something you could purchase, install. There's also weather stations located kind of within regions that you can refer to. You can look online and say, hey, what's my nearest weather station? You can check in and see what's going on, but you can also install them yourself in your vineyard, which is very, very helpful. So this will help to track real-time data for you of what was today's high temperature, and what was our low, and what was our wind speed, and what was our humidity, and then also what was our rainfall, right? There's so many different pieces of information that you can get from that weather station. It's very helpful to know what's going on in your site, right? Another one that we'll talk about in a couple slides here is heat summation, which kind of follows along with growing degree days. It's very important to know also when your vineyard is going to experience frost. So when in the spring is it going to frost, and when in the fall is it going to frost? We'll talk about that more in a couple slides. Your low winter temperatures, how cold is it going to get over the winter? Is that going to potentially damage your vines? Are they going to make it out okay? Maximum minimum temperatures during the day, we call this diurnal temperatures or diurnal temperature shifts. That's also very important. We have a slide on that. Your relative humidity, rainfall, the amounts and distribution of it, wind direction and velocity, right? Direction is important because you want to plant your rows in a way that benefits them. Velocity is also important because if you live in an area with high winds, you can actually damage your vines, which is not ideal, right? Then we also have photosynthetically active light conditions, also known as PAR. These are really nice because this is the actual range of light that is ideal for photosynthesis to occur. So you might receive light to some extent, but it might not actually be the ideal range for your plant to grow and flourish. So very important also for like greenhouses and other like closed systems for growing plants, because you can produce this with like specialized lighting and stuff. Cool. It's also really important to know that you actually need multiple years of data to really get a complete idea of a vineyard's mesoclimate. So, seasons change. Some winters are colder than others. Some springs, are not what they are in years. So multiple years of data is the most ideal situation to really understand what you're working with, right? Perfect. Bodies of water. So water is really cool because it works as a temperature regulator. A lot of the famous winemaking regions of the world are tied to a body of water or some other way to moderate their temperature. So we have a couple different examples of this. We have the Mosel River in Germany, and you can see there's a really steep slopes located right next to this very large body of water, this river that flows through the region. Then we also have the Finger Lakes in New York. New York is actually another very big winemaking region. I know a lot of people don't think that right away when they think about New York, but there's a lot of wine in New York. So this is a vineyard kind of on a gentle slope next to this large lake here. So yeah, large bodies of water are ultimately very helpful to vineyards and surrounding areas, right? They have a nice temperature effect. They can help moderate changes in seasons in vineyards. So what does that mean? So water can absorb heat. It has a very nice heat retention. It can absorb heat and stay hot. This will help extend the growing season and buffer the midwinter temperatures to prevent vine damage. So you think it's a really hot summer, the water is slowly absorbing all of that heat. Just as temperatures start to drop into the fall and winter, that water is still warm. So it actually kind of works as like a heater for the land mass around it to kind of keep it from becoming cold faster. And it will eventually start to absorb that cold weather, but it'll actually take quite a bit of time before that water gets cold, right? And then on the opposite side of that, once that water does get cold and absorb all of that cool temperature, if there's a sudden heat swing in the spring, then it will actually help moderate and keep the surrounding area cool, which is actually a benefit because it will delay your bud break, which then could lengthen your growing season and allow you to be safe from a frost damage event, right? So if your buds are delayed from breaking, say you have a heat swing, which we've seen a lot locally in these past couple of years, right? I know my mom always gets really upset because she lives in Pollock Pines and she has this dogwood tree, and in the springtime there's always this like heat wave way too early in the season, and then the dogwood starts blooming, and then all of a sudden it snows or like it hails in Pollock Pines, right? And then all of the buds, all the flowers get wrecked because of the frost. So she always gets very sad about that. But if we live next to a body of water, that would help protect us from that situation happening because that body of water would help regulate that heat spike that came through, keep it nice and cool during that time. So hopefully that makes sense, right? Okay, so the direct effect of the large body of water on vineyards depends on the distance from the vineyard, right? So even though we live in Pollock Pines, for example, Lake Tahoe is not regulating our climate for us, right? If we were going to plant grapevines in Pollock Pines, Lake Tahoe is too far away, right? The elevation above the water also has an impact. So if you have steep slopes, has less of effect. If you have mild slopes, the effect can reach farther inland, right? Because cool air sinks, right? So it's going to stay closer to the bottom. Hot air rises. So any type of effect will stay closer to the bottom there. Okay, so why is water such a good temperature regulator? So I actually learned this in chemistry class back in the day. This is not in the textbook, but I just think it's really cool and everyone should know about it. So there's something in chemistry called specific heat capacity. And the definition of this is it's the amount of heat needed to raise the temperature of 1 gram of substance by 1 degree Celsius. So it is basically like the strength of this substance to retain its temperature, right? So how much energy do I need to put into this substance for it to increase in temperature? Well, water is at 1 calorie per gram degree Celsius, right? That doesn't seem like much when you compare it to all these other substances. That's crazy. So silver, a metal, right? Highly conductive, 0.056. That makes sense, right? Glass at 0.2, alcohol at 0.58, granite 0.19, olive oil, iron. So none of these are even close to what water is. I mean, alcohol I think is our closest contender at 0.58, but water is actually a very strong substance. It's very stable. It handles itself very well. It's a very interesting substance and like compound in general. So it takes a lot of energy to change its temperature, which means that water is actually a pretty decent form of refrigerant, and it is actually better for the environment, of course, right? So most tanks at a winery need to be refrigerated at a certain point. They have this dimple double jacketed system. The dimples help increase the surface area on the tank. And typically we run some kind of refrigerant through this to chill the tank or heat the tank in certain situations. And most wineries that I've worked at locally have just used water. You can use a water glycol mixture or even ammonia. Water is very cheap, it's easy to access, and it's not harmful for the environment if it gets spilled. So water is a wonderful alternative for a temperature regulator. So just a little fun fact, side quest for you there. Okay, components of climate. So what makes climate a thing? Temperature, the diurnal temperature variation. We have our maximum summer temps, our minimum winter temperatures, frost potential, solar radiation, rainfall, humidity, wind, evaporation, and that's everything. So a lot of components go into climate, right? Climate is one big puzzle with a lot of pieces to it that come together to fit your specific site that you're working with, right? So really important that you do the research. Temperature. So overall, in a perfect world, the ideal temperature for growing a grapevine is between 77 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit. It actually enjoys those warmer days, right? Which works out really well for us in our region. Below this temperature, you get a lot of limitation on your vegetative growth. It just has a hard time growing. It grows very slowly, but it's not impossible, right? Average, it will limit, why did I say average? Limits photosynthesis rates due to an increase, above. This is supposed to say above average. I'm going to fix that. Sorry, guys. If it's above 90 degrees, it can limit photosynthesis rate due to an increase in respiration. So it's actually at about, I think it's 105 degrees Fahrenheit, we actually see grapevines start to shut down in the vineyard. So if you're measuring the sugar content of your grapes, you're trying to figure out when to harvest. If you have a spike in heat in your region, you just have a really hot season, the vines will just stop producing sugar. So it'll get really hot. You won't see any adjustments in bricks. They won't rise. They won't fall. They'll just stay where they're at. And it's kind of like a stalemate or like a standoff, right? So until that temperature drops back to, mid 90s, the vineyard will actually halt sugar production. So if this is above, not average. It must have been a text suggestion by autofill. Another important thing to know is that budburst itself is really sensitive to fluctuations in air temperatures. So you want to have relatively calm temperatures around that time of the year, or you can have a hard time. Typically, if you have a cooler growing season, you'll have higher acid in your grapes and lower sugars. If you have a warmer growing season, generally speaking, you'll see higher levels of sugar and lower acid levels. So that's just how it kind of works out. With warmer temperatures, sugars increase very quickly and acids metabolize quickly. When it's a little bit cooler, we can retain some of that acid and the sugar doesn't get out of hand. It still ripens, but at a slower rate, and you see a much more balanced ratio of sugar to acid in grapes, right? So kind of a good example of this is this little picture here in Chardonnay. A cool climate, you'll typically see more citrus and kind of grapefruit components. And then warmer climates, you see kind of mango, stone fruit like peach, pineapple. So you'll see more acid in cooler climate Chardonnays and kind of medium body. And then for warm climate, you'll see less acid, but more body, right? And other aromas, this is kind of just winemaking decisions. This doesn't really have to do with climate, but that's what you can expect, generally speaking, from a cool climate Chardonnay versus a warm climate Chardonnay. So hopefully that helps. Okay, diurnal temperature variation. What is it? Because everyone talks about it. If you read any article about any winemaking region in the Sierra foothills or in California, this is like the buzzword, diurnal temperature variation. If you haven't seen it before, you'll see it now and you'll see it a million times for the rest of this year. So it's a fancy term for the difference between the highest temperature of the day and the lowest temperature of the night, right? So diurnal, di meaning two, right? Urnal for the day, and then variation, right? So daily highs, daily lows. This is very helpful to grapevines. It helps to lengthen the growing season because the cooler temperatures at night allows the vine to rest, so to speak, right? So during the day, we have photosynthesis and sugar development, and at the night, we slow down this ripening process and we preserve the acid levels in the grape, right? So ultimately, we have a much more balanced ripening. It allows for a longer hang time. A lot of winemakers talk about their hang time, which will help to develop more flavor, because it isn't until the last stage of development for grapes that they start to develop the really nice aroma characteristics. So if you are just blasted with too hot of a growing season and it stays hot at night, you'll see sugars just go through the roof and acids will just drop, and then you'll get to a point where you have to harvest your grapes because the sugar content is so high and the acids are gone, but the grape skins didn't actually ever get a chance to ripen physiologically, right? So they didn't get to develop those fruity flavors or those precursors that you'll see change into complexity during the fermentation process. So that's why diurnal temperature variation is so important for grapevines. We also have a really nice article here from the Decanter about diurnal temperature effects on a vineyard. Okay, so temperature-based metrics for assessing a site. We have growing degree days, which we briefly mentioned, but we'll get more into. The textbook also goes into some fun ones like latitude temperature index, which is much more of a focus on cooler climates, but also factors in the latitude of that location. So Like New Zealand, for example, is a cooler climate region, but it's an exception because of its latitude position. It actually has a longer day to grow than other cool regions that are like closer to the equator, right? So that factors in that component. It makes a little more detail. There's also frost-free days in the spring frost index, very important. And then also the average growing season temperature. So we'll touch a little bit on these, but the textbook has more information if you'd like to know. Growing degree days is going to be the big one that we'll talk about. So growing degree days, also known as GDD, also known as the Winkler Index or the Heat Summation Index. So if you see that, they're all related. They're all friends, right? So it's technically a measure of heat accumulation during the growing season. This will help determine when your grapes will reach maturity, which is very important for selecting what grape varieties will be successful in your vineyard. So for the Northern Hemisphere, our growing season typically runs April 1st through October 31st. So the measure of the total heat a vine receives, I'm off sentence. So yeah, Northern Hemisphere, we have our own growing season. When we're calculating our Winkler Index or our growing degree days, we measure the total heat a vine receives above the basal development temperature. So 50 degrees is the cutoff for when the vine will start growing, right? So we want to start measuring as soon as the temperature gets above 50. This is a useful tool when deciding what grape varieties to plant in a certain area, right? So essentially, the formula is growing degree days equals the sum of your daily max plus your daily minimum temperature divided by 2, and then you subtract that by 50. So you do that for every day, and then you just get this very large number, right? And that will place you in a region. We typically have regions 1 through 5 in our Winkler Index, with 1 being the lowest, the coolest growing degree days, and 5 being the warmest or hottest climate that you can have for growing degrees. And if you look at the map of our state here, this makes a lot of sense, right? We have region 5 in the Central Valley. Central Valley gets very hot very easily, and then we also have it down here towards kind of our desert region of California, down in the south towards Mexico. So this really pans out. We also have some spots of region 1 near our coastal cooler areas, and mixed in with some region 2. I really wish they didn't make 2 almost the same color as 5 in this chart, but that's okay. We have region 2 speckled around our region 1s. We have some warm pockets. Region 3 are speckled in with 2, right? And then 4 we have with 1, right? Here's a cool little concept here. So if we see this pocket, hopefully, yeah, you can see my mouse, good. So we have this red blob in the center of our state, but we have this pocket of green. So it goes from 5 to 4 here. And the reason it does that is because we have this beautiful body of water in our Bay Area. This water actually, and this is a low elevation too, the cool air from this water actually comes in and creates a pocket of cooler climate right here in the heart of our state, which is really cool. So this is a perfect example of how water regulates climate and temperature in our growing regions. So that's a little fun thing for you there. Cool. So here's an example of the Winkler Index. We have regions 1 through 5. Over time, we've been able to split it into 1A, 1B, and kind of subclass it for more detail. So here's an example of the degree days. So region 1A is anywhere between 1,500 to 2,000 degree growing days. This includes light-bodied white wines and areas like Chablis, the Moselle Valley, and Champagne. Region 1B is slightly warmer. It includes Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Sauvignon Blanc, Riesling. This includes the Rhine and Moselle Valleys, Burgundy, Willamette Valley, and then we have more, of course, but you want to skip ahead to region 5, right? So very different from region 1. degree days are completely different, 4,000 to 4,900, so much hotter, right? This is in degrees Fahrenheit. So now we're talking Central Valley of California, inland Australia, Morocco, Madeira, Apulia, and Jerez in Spain. So very, very hot areas. So completely different, but just shows the variety of wines or grapes that you can grow in these regions, and how knowing your climate can really help you determine what's going to be successful in your area, right? Lovely. Okay, so we've learned about growing degree days, the Winkler Index. Next, we're going to talk about frost-free days, which is kind of what it sounds like. So this is the window of time between the last spring frost and the first plant-killing frost of fall, right? So how much time do you have between those two significant frosts to safely grow grapes to produce high-quality wine, right, that you can depend on, right? So that's your window of time. Frost, of course, is a major risk at any point of the grapevine's development. So bud break, right? You could lose your entire crop. Here is a picture of frost damage shortly after bud break. We don't have a lot of shoot development on this head-trained vine. We have just some leaves here. This was before and after, 1 day difference between a regular day and a freeze. So this kills the entire crop essentially. There might be some secondary buds that come out of this. They might be able to harvest something, but it'll be significant damage to their harvest, right? Flowering, you don't want that either because you'll have a similar situation. Even during harvest, if you have a frost, it can kill all the leaves on your grapevine. And if you don't have leaves, you don't have photosynthesis, and you can't ripen your grapes. So that could be a huge upset as well, right? So if you have a vineyard in a region that has a low number of frost-free days, you'll need to consider planting a variety that ripens very quickly because your window of safe time to ripen is so small, right? So the numbers for this, we have unsuitable, marginal, and preferable. Unsuitable window would be less than 165 days. That's not going to be enough time to really produce something that's going to make quality wine or be within the range to make something good, right? Marginal, 166 to 180. You could do it. You're still going to have a risk involved, but it's possible. Preferable is a window of over 180 days frost-free. So something good to know. In addition to that, we also have the Spring Frost Index. This is to evaluate a site's risk for spring frost. So say you've already developed your vineyard, you've had some really good years, but you've had a couple of seasons where you got hit by frost. Maybe you have some developments or processes in place to combat frost, but you're trying to figure out when that might happen, right? So this is kind of a situation that can help you do that. So in addition to having a weather station, right, you can calculate the Spring Frost Index with a couple different things. So you would take the site's average mean and average minimum temperatures for a given month. You would calculate both of these things, so average mean temperature and average minimum temperature. So you take average out the daily mean, so daily high plus daily low divided by 2, and then average of all minimum temperatures of the month, right? Very good. If the difference between these two values increases, you'll have the greater risk of frost hazard, right? Because if it's your mean temperature is high, that means your grapevines are growing most likely, right? Because you have those warm days and cool nights. But then if your minimum temperature stays low, you're going to have the risk of damaging that new growth, right? So it does make sense. So generally speaking, values less than 11 have a low frost risk. So a difference greater than 11, then you would start worrying, right? Cool. And we also have the Farmer's Almanac for frost dates by zip code, which is kind of helpful too. So you can use that. Okay, that brings us to our student learning objectives. This is just part 1 of this presentation. Part 2 will include topography, soil, water quality. That will be our next presentation. I will post a quiz for part 1. Please do it when you can. Also, I know a lot of us are behind on our quizzes. I reopened those. I also opened them so you could take them twice. You could take them a second time if you would like to, if you weren't happy with your first score. I want you guys to be successful. This is not a punishment or a power trip for me. So definitely take the opportunity to do that and catch up. This 8-week course goes by very fast. So please do that. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email, of course. And as always, I look forward to seeing you guys next time.